I have a very special podcast guest with me today, Dr. Michael Fenster. He's a board-certified American interventional cardiologist. He's also a professional chef. He's a professor of culinary medicine at the University of Montana. He has appeared in many television and media appearances, such as Fox National News, including the show The Doctors, and has hosted a national radio show called Code Delicious with Dr. Mike. And he's also written several books, including his latest, The Food Shaman, The Art of Quantum Food, Ancient Eats, The Greeks and Vikings, and The Fallacy of The Calorie, Why the Modern Western Diet is Killing Us and How to Stop It. So there are several reasons why I'm super excited to have Dr. Fenster here with us today. One of the reasons being that when it comes to diet and cardiovascular health, there is so much, contradicting information out there that it becomes very confusing for both doctors and anyone trying to kind of lead a healthy lifestyle to know what's correct and what's not. And therefore we have one of the leading experts, worldwide leading experts in the field today. So without further ado, Dr. Fenster, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I feel like I'm making a whirlwind tour without the jet lag, doing it virtually. I was speaking yesterday at the UK conference, international conference on food and nutrition sciences at the University of Manchester. Now I'm with you over in the continent, and all this and no jet lag.
Yeah, one of the bright sides, definitely one of the very few bright sides of the pandemic, I would say. Right. So maybe you want to start by telling us a little bit about your work.
Oh, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm an interventional cardiologist. So I still work as a clinical cardiologist, seeing patients, putting stents in, all of that. My other background is that I'm also a professional chef. And over the years, that love of food and obviously health, and particularly heart health, which is intimately related to diet, as you mentioned, led to the development of a culinary medicine approach. And so I teach culinary medicine at the University of Montana, and I hold joint faculty appointments in the College of Health at the University of Montana, as well as our culinary arts program. So what's unique about our culinary medicine program is that it really does have a foot in the culinary world and a foot in the health-based world, with the College of Health and Medicine. So I think it brings a unique perspective. One of the things that I was talking about at my talk yesterday that I'd love to share with you and your listeners and viewers is that, so often from a medical perspective, we end up dictating to people what to eat this, don't eat that. And we forget the fact, a very basic fact that all chefs know, which is people, for the average person, food is about fun. It's about pleasure. It's about play. And when we tell people you have to eat this, you cannot eat that, we start to make it work for them. And I think that is the reason a lot of dietary approaches fail in the long run. Right.
I love that. I'm definitely going to circle back to that one. So I want to, at this point, ask you, heart health has, when we look at the statistic, the cardiovascular diseases, it has increased so drastically, especially in the Western, modern with the Western lifestyle. And what is your take on this? Is that partially or, due to diet, and what are we doing wrong?
Great question. And the short answer is, yeah, absolutely. We noticed this coming about after World War II, this increase, not only in cardiovascular disease, which is a number one cause of death in the United States and many industrialized nations around the world, but we've also seen increases in obesity and diabetes and inflammatory bowel disease and neurodegenerative diseases. And what they all have in common that we fairly recently have learned is this root cause of inflammation. And what we're also learning is that it's intimately tied to our diet. So any disease we can define in an equation as, we have some predisposition based on genetics or some protections. And then there's also the environmental aspects. And that combination of variables will result in a manifestation of disease or not. And when we think about environment, we don't often consider it this way, but there's no bigger effect of the environment than what we eat, because we're taking the outside environment and putting it in our bodies every day.
Yeah. Also, when we look at the recommendation, the dietary recommendations that come from the World Health Organization, the American Heart Association, and all these big institutions, we see several decades ago, the recommendation was that a high-fat diet is detrimental to cardiovascular health. But also what we see in recent years is some studies pointing out to the fact that dietary carbohydrates and refined sugars are even worse for heart health, and a certain level of healthy fat is necessary to live. And we see a lot of confusion even in the media. Some people are taking extremely high amount of fat due to dietary latest dietary trends such as the ketogenic diet. And where does the heart health come when you consider all of these factors?
That's a great question. And that really cuts to, forgive the pun, but cuts to the heart of what we look at in terms of culinary medicine. And so when we look historically, what we find is that, about 50 years ago in the 1970s is when these recommendations, started to come out. Was yes, in the 1970s, if we look about 50 years ago, we really got off on the wrong track, and the science wasn't very good. And there's a number of reasons for that, and we talk about that. But the basics, if I could summarize it, if we look at the fat recommendations that you talked about, which many people are still buying into a half century later, even though it's obviously failed us. That was 30% total dietary fat, 10%. American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology actually call for less than that in their current recommendations. Yet, what was that based on? Well, it was based on 6 trials. The total sum of the number of people in those trials was 2,500, actually less. They were all male, mostly Caucasian. 5 of those studies were secondary prevention trials. Not one actually looked at the recommendations as they were proposed. So the end result of all this, when we look at that, because what the trial showed is in the intervention groups, cholesterol dropped. And what do you think happened? It turned out there was no difference in mortality overall, no difference in cardiovascular mortality. So you drop cholesterol, no lives were saved. On the basis of that, via the government buying into the saturated fat hypothesis, 220 million US and 56 million people in the UK by 1983 were subject to these guidelines. And if we look at the empirical results, we can see that they have failed. Yeah. So we missed something. And you really hit on it. You said, well, what have we missed? Is it the fat? Is it the sugar? When we look, and what we've done in our study of culinary medicine is look at historical contemporary diets from around the world, much kind of like the blue zones, and say when people are healthy and in these what we term paradoxes, the French paradox, the Inuit paradox, etc., what are these populations doing different? Because the Inuits, in the Arctic Circle eat a very different diet than the people in southern France. Right. Yet they don't suffer the heart disease and other diseases we see in the US and other countries. Yeah. Well, it turns out that really the way we look at food has been wrong. So after World War II, there was a huge change to our food and food pathways in terms of processing. So we added things and we took things out of our foods. We adulterate them. And you could see behind me, I've got a delicious bison burger, right? That's raised here in Montana, USA, from a friend of mine. And this is grass finished, organic, raised with love and kindness. That's very different than a takeaway, industrial patty. Yet in the studies, it always just says red meat. And so when we look at these food classifications, as they've started to do it, this was developed by the University of Brazil, something called the NOVA classification, which looks at food not by red meat or vegetable or seafood, but actually looks at it by processing and level of ultra processing. They
Yeah.
find a great correlation in terms of the disease manifestation, incidence and prevalence by the amount of adulteration. And so it's not so much the exact category, because as human beings, we're built to eat a lot of different foods.
Yeah.
But it's really, it's in a word, it's not complicated. It's about getting back to real simple, authentic food. And when we stay away from the processing and the adulteration, we find that we're much, much healthier. And that actually has to do with the gut microbiome, which we talk about in culinary medicine. That's only something that's really come to the forefront of medical sciences in the last decade.
Right, right, right. I absolutely love that. You look at more the processing and the how where the food is coming from, rather than classifying different types of food and putting label on them that this is bad or the other one is good. That totally does make a lot of sense. I love that. And you talk about microbiomes, and I want to learn about this from you, because a lot of us are popping, probiotic pills, but still not seeing any significant improvements. So what's the best way to go when we want to have really healthy gut microbiome?
Well, and that's a great question, and I think we're still learning about that. What it seems to be is, what's very interesting is everybody's gut microbiome is like their fingerprint. We all have them, but they're very individual. Even twins living within the same house will have differences in their gut microbiome. And as an interventional cardiologist, I can tell you, most everybody has 3 coronary arteries. There's some anatomic variations. And people have a right coronary artery, a left main, and then a left anterior descending, left circumflex. But outside of that basic pattern, man, I'm in decades of doing this, I've never seen 2 coronary trees look exactly the same.
Yeah.
They're always different where the branches come off and things like that. And it looks like our gut microbiome is kind of the same. It's very individual. But some of the things we do know is that a healthy gut microbiome needs to be fed. It's like having a pet, right? You can't just sort of, and what people do when they're just popping these probiotic pills and they're going through the takeaway and eating the fast food and the junk food and those sorts of things, it's like they're just buying a new pet each week. They're not taking care of the one they have. And so once we develop and we can jumpstart our gut microbiomes with good probiotics, if you don't want to pay for the pills, our ancestors really knew what they were doing, because it turns out that the fermented foods that they use to preserve foods are full of probiotics that are so good for us. You can look at sauerkrauts in Germany, kimchi, across the Orient, many pickled foods from Asia and India, again, pickled and fermented foods in the Arctic North. So every culture has some form of these fermented foods. Wine is a fermented food. And that seeds our gut with good bacteria. And then what we have to do is we have to feed them. And what we've learned so far is that really the best food are the carbohydrates. So you talked earlier about where the diet is like no carbs, bad carbs, don't eat carbs. That's fruits and vegetables. They're really good for us. We really don't eat enough of them. And they're the food to keep that gut bacteria healthy. When we talk about avoiding carbs, we got to separate out. And really, this goes back to what we talked about earlier. It was noted in the 1950s and through the 1970s and promoted by a nutritionist out of the UK, John Yudkin, who said, the problem is not saturated fat, it's added sugar. It's refined carbohydrates. And indeed, we see that those can jumpstart our bodies and push it towards a more inflammatory condition. So we want carbohydrates, but we want to avoid the refined carbohydrates, particularly the sugars. And what people don't realize, particularly in the US, is that we find refined sugars in places that you wouldn't think. So a loaf of bread in the US has a tremendous amount of sugar. So not a place people would think, because it's kind of savory. But processed foods, there's a whole art to doing that. And in industry, they are built on what's called a bliss point. So if they're developing a chip, a crisp, so that you want it and you want to buy that brand, it looks at combinations of sugar, salt, and fat, maybe more salt and fat because that's what you expect. If they're doing a donut, more sugar and fat.
Yeah.
But that combination actually hits our cerebral wiring and actually acts sort of like a drug to want us to crave more of those highly processed foods.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because we want that fast source of energy, right, from an evolution standpoint. Right.
Yeah, well, exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, we're wired. The way we metabolize food hasn't changed in hundreds of thousands of years. So you and I are wired like our ancestors were wired. And if you eat that apple from the apple tree and the saber-toothed tiger starts chasing us, and you've got energy to get ahead of me, I'm dinner for the saber-toothed tiger, and you survive. So yeah, we're definitely hardwired for those sorts of things. And the modern food industry knows how to take advantage of that.
Yeah, right, right. What we totally miss is the fact that we're taking in all these calories and we're just sitting at our computers and playing video games, and we're not doing that, 10-kilometer run that our ancestors used to do. So the food industry is built in this way to, get us all in this addictive pattern of almost, food addiction. Do you see any significant changes happening right now? And also, there is a certain level of awareness, it's there, but is the government in the US and all over the world, the World Health Organization, are all these big organizations taking enough steps that we see in the coming years that there is a, change in availability of food, that people have more options to make the right food choices? Do you think enough is being done?
I don't. And I think that the reason behind that, like a lot of things, is simply follow the money. What you have, in our lifetime and really developed and matured out of the following the decades in World War II is this promotion of a convenience culture, and then really the rise of this, what we call big snack, big soda, big food, which is the fast foods. I mean, if you look at a company like McDonald's, it is a huge economic force. If McDonald's was a country, there's about 195 countries in the world, I believe. If McDonald's was a country, it would have the 90th largest economy in and of itself. So you're talking about, an entity, just one of them, with a huge amount of economic, influence and a lot of resources behind it. And that makes it, very difficult for people like me to get the word out that, hey, if you want to make McDonald's an occasional treat, fine. But, that shouldn't be your grocery store. That shouldn't be where you get your meal every day, for a number of reasons that we've kind of talked about. And, people like you are doing these podcasts, getting the word out. We can make changes, but it has to occur, I think, at a very grassroots level. But it can be successful. And I'll give you an example. In the United States, Walmart is a huge international company, huge in the United States. They are the number one purchaser and distributor of organic vegetables. And it's not because Walmart cares about how healthy Chef Dr. Mike is. It's because Walmart can make $1 doing it. And they know that there's a demand for it. So therefore, they will carry those items. So if people start supporting, local sustainable sources of food, get to know their food again, connect to the food that you're eating, both when you're sitting there, knowing where it comes from, how it was produced. I always tell folks in our class, we have a section in our class called the Art of Sorcery, which is all about how to source food. But there's 3 simple questions. So if you're going to buy something from the market or go out from the marketplace, just ask yourself, how was it bred? So is it, an Alaskan wild caught salmon? Is it an Atlantic farm salmon? What was it fed? So is this tomato, organically raised, or was it grown, with GMO, herbicides and pesticides? And then where was it led? How much post-processing went on? Was it delivered straight to me, fresh, wholesome, minimally adulterated? Or, is it a piece of fish, but now it's a square breaded patty? So ask yourself, those three questions, and guide your purchases with those things in mind. And we can drive it, because the business will follow where the money is. But right now they've got awful lot of influence to kind of shut us down. One other further, just quick, great example of how we can make a difference is Bolivia. So we talked about McDonald's. They went into Bolivia, but the food culture there was like, we don't do fast food. We do our traditional foods, and food is about being shared. We don't get a takeaway and eat by ourselves. And because of the culture there, McDonald's actually ended up closing their restaurants in Bolivia because they weren't successful. So there is hope.
Wow. I love that. Okay. So you teach culinary medicine, and where I studied medicine, I'm not aware that there was a course called Culinary Medicine, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of my colleagues have also not had the opportunity of attending an amazing course like that. So is this course designed for doctors, medical students?
Yes, and I didn't have one either. In fact, I'm so old. When I went back, when we were still using leeches and horse-drawn carts, back in medical school, they told us, oh, the bacteria in the gut, that's just a commensal evolutionary kind of freaky thing. They don't play any active role, in our health. And gosh, that's so far from the truth. So our course actually is available online. And we offer through the University of Montana a certificate. Just our level 1 courses now, that just came out this summer. And we've actually had some medical professionals, physicians in Thailand and in the US, graduate with that and start to incorporate and start their own culinary medicine programs, based on these teachings. So it certainly is. And actually in the US, our course has been awarded 36 continuing medical education units. So it's vetted in that sense as well. And it's geared towards anyone who's interested in food and health. So it's certainly in a language the general public can understand. We have culinary professionals taking it, but we had a number of medical professionals, nurses, physician's assistants, physicians themselves take the course. And we'll also be rolling it out to medical students. I'm also an assistant professor at the Kansas Health Science Center here in the States. And we're looking forward to getting ready to incorporate that and potentially roll that out for medical students as well. And what we have available online is our level 1, but we have a level 2 and then ultimately level 3, which would be the equivalent of getting a degree in culinary medicine. So, even when you finish with the level 1 course, you're already light years ahead of, and I think you would agree, kind of the average medical professional, because we just don't get a lot of, certainly in the States, really a lot of information about, health, nutrition, and certainly not the kind of the cutting edge stuff, which is what we really work on and stay up on in the course, the gut microbiome and fascinating things outside of just the area of nutrition. For example, the studies have shown that how we eat, so mindfulness participation, changes the pathways in our brain. And when we put intent in, we're really using our frontal lobe. Long story short, we can measure reduced markers of inflammation based specifically on the incorporation of food ritual into how we eat, as opposed to constantly looking at nutrition with things and in categories and classifications that don't make sense today. As we talked about red meat, it really doesn't, that's a category that doesn't make sense to me, because it lumps so many things together that are so different. And really less than 10 years ago, it only occurred to us that fresh meat is different than processed meat, and trying to tease that information out. You mentioned WHO recommendations, and they say, well, stay away from, processed meat. That's a potential carcinogen, as is, Roundup, things treated with that herbicide. But the question is, from a chef's perspective, every time I cook a hamburger or cook a wurst, a sausage, that's processing. We're thermally processing it. So what do we mean by that? We need a lot more education and investigation into that area.
Right, right. So I do want to know, like, processed, when you say processed meat is a potential carcinogen, so is it also like meat that are like sausages and all kinds of, canned meat? So these all fall under the category?
Well, you brought up the perfect example. Absolutely brilliant. So sausage. So I make fresh sausage, and I have a heritage breed, organically raised, Berkshire, Red Wattle, or Gloucester pork that comes to me, and then I add fresh herbs and spices. That is an incredibly healthful offering. If you're someone who eats meat, that's a great thing. And in fact, I had a discussion with a nutritionist who runs the nutrition program at one of the medical schools here in the States. She actually wrote a sausage making book because sausage could be so healthy. At the other end of the extreme is, something that is raised here in the US, we call them CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. The animals are not treated well. They're fed GMO feed. The species that they use are bred to mature quickly, have a lot of fat, so they have a lot of weight. Again, we're talking about two very different kinds of things. And then that meat undergoes a lot of additives. And it's that sort of ultra processing, emulsifiers, etc., that what we see is that even if they don't necessarily have an effect on human cells, they alter the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome becomes leaky and serves as a nidus for inflammation. And so and Hippocrates wrote over 2,500 years ago, all disease starts in the gut, and he was right. And that's where that inflammation seems to start. They showed not too long ago in France, for example, that Parkinson's actually probably begins in the gut. So you could see changes in the enteric nervous system. So the neurons of our gut are the same as the neurons in our brain. And you could see the changes of Parkinson's in the neurons of the gut decades before you see them manifest in the brain. So it begs the question, is Parkinson's some sort of gut disease that the late manifestation is, cerebral issues? And we know that people with Parkinson's have gut motility disorders, and that can be a first manifestation. So there's all this connection going on. And what we can do when we look at our diet is, and again, brilliant example with the sausage, it's not sausage, it's, how was it bred? What was it fed? Where was it led? There's my homemade organic, sausage made with fresh herbs, organic meats, and fresh spices, or there's an industrial one that has all these additives. If you want to make chicken nuggets at home, you use a chicken and maybe some bread and a little breading, maybe 3-5 ingredients at most. A McDonald's nugget has 40 ingredients in it.
Yeah.
And that's the difference, there and then.
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing I find really interesting is fried food, because when you're heating oil up to such high temperatures, the oil kind of structure breaks, and these fat molecules actually make up of our brain structure. Like they actually, they make your brain up. So when you have all these damaged fat molecules making up your brain structure, that is a recipe for disaster, I think. So food culture, in most food cultures, we fry food in most cultures. So what would you, as the cardiologist and professional chef, what would you use to fry and to cook?
Well, I don't deep fry a lot. Very occasionally,
Yeah.
I might make some chips, but I have chips maybe 3-4 times a year. For kind of a special occasion, a special dinner or something. If I'm really feeling kind of French, I'll have some pommes frites, but that's a special treat. the deep frying goes along with the fast food and the convenience culture, because what you have in that situation is you have people, they're not the chef crafting their food, with love and care and enjoying these ingredients. They're simply assembling parts, and these parts, because of convenience, it takes no skill to turn the fryer on. It's preset. I drop it in, a timer goes off, and I give you your fish patty. So I don't recommend deep frying for all the reasons that you said. When we heat oils up to the very high temperatures that we use in deep frying, for example, they do undergo structural changes. Particularly, believe it or not, it's worse to deep fry with vegetable oils because they contain unsaturated, they're either monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. Because they're unsaturated, that's how you get trans fatty acids. You have to have that carbon double bond for them to shift their configuration, from cis to trans. And that's, and whatever it says on the bag, anytime you heat those vegetable oils to the high temperatures, as you pointed out, in deep frying, you're creating trans fatty acids, which we, as you mentioned, are horrible. They're like just explosive devices, in our system, causing inflammation. So I really don't recommend a whole lot of, I save that kind of for special occasions. Lightly sauteing is great. That's fine. And generally when we do that, for example, if you're using olive oil, you're not getting to super high temperatures because the smoke point of olive oil is lower. So it depends on the types of oils that you use as to the temperatures that you heat things at. So you can, if you want a high temperature and you want it to be stable, you can use an avocado oil. You can get that to 350 degrees. You're not anywhere near the smoke point. Okay. A little sauteing with olive oil. Yeah, I do that all the time. And we see that, empirically, the data, when we look at studies done from in the Mediterranean diet approach, which uses a lot of olive oil and sauteing and cooking, not deep frying, but just in that form of preparing our food, we see very healthy outcomes. And there's a whole host of data on that from the PREDIMED group. They've done a great job looking at the Mediterranean diet. And in fact, I'd even mentioned following what I call really the Mediterranean approach, because there's like 20 plus countries in the Mediterranean. So there's a whole host of different diets and uses. But what is consistent is they use fresh foods. They're not buying a lot of canned preserved foods. They're going to markets once a week. And their methods of cooking, and you bring up a great point, which is not just what we get, but how we prepare it. Not a whole lot of deep frying, just maybe, like I said, sauteing with olive oil, those sorts of things. Stews, another great way to cook in healthy cultures around the world. And an important aspect of when we stew or braise meats is that I don't know if it's big in Europe. In the United States, they've gone crazy for bone broth, which as a chef is just stock. And it has a lot of great benefits. But it's, in the kitchen, we laugh as chefs because it's made up of all the stuff most people throw away. It's, it's the awful bits, it's the cuts, it's the bones and whatnot. Incredibly great for us. But if we use stews and braising techniques and cook them low and slow all day, that's a great way to get those kind of nutrients and that kind of power into our food. And it's economical. So if you're buying organic, grass-fed, heritage breed meats that are expensive, you want to use everything. Part of what we want to do in culinary medicine is what I call the zero waste kitchen, which is, as a professional chef, when I ran a kitchen, I had to control my food cost. And it just means we don't waste anything. So when you cut a top off a carrot, you don't throw it away. You put it in a box and you'll use it later to make stock or, something like that. So these are all things we teach every month around the world. It's free and you can sign up and get our webinars. We do practical culinary medicine webinars and we talk about, those sorts of things. How do we take what's in the classroom and the things you and I are talking about and put it into practice in your kitchen? Because that's the other big challenge for folks. I mean, it's one thing to tell somebody to eat something, eat this, eat that, shop this way, but how do you do it? And that's what people need to know.
Yeah, love that. So we're gonna put all these links in the description, so the people watching, they can really learn all this stuff. That would be totally awesome, and I'm totally gonna sign up for that one as well. Yeah. So Looking into our current, world situation with COVID, a lot of people are struggling with so many different things, and especially with regards to heart health. You probably agree with me that heart health is so directly related to our emotional state and, what we're going through in life. A lot of people isolated and feeling, really cut off from the rest of the world. Do you have any tips for all of us?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and you are spot on. One of the most interesting cardiology studies I ever saw had to do with Twitter. And so what they did in the States is they looked at Twitter and they found the places in the US that were the angriest, like where were the most mean tweets on Twitter in all of the United States. And then they superimposed heart attacks. And it was like a perfect match. So angry Twitter tweets were more predictive of having a heart attack than your blood pressure, your cholesterol level, etc. So you are spot on when you talk about the emotional connection. And we talk about that because that's an important part of our food relationship is, and you mentioned it, some people have food addiction, some people emotionally eat, etc. So there's a whole separate talk, in there that you really hit on with emotions and food. And in this times of stress, and particularly, as you said, people are isolated, feeling alone. Take some time for yourself, and I'd share that how we eat food is nothing new. There's a great story, and this was actually told by a 20th century food writer MFK Fisher, and it goes like this: there was a politician in ancient Rome named Lucius Lucellus, and he was a very famous guy, obviously big wig in Rome. And he looked at his night's menu and he said, this is looking a little dull. And so he goes to his cook. He says, I want you to change the menu and come up with these dishes. And so the cook looked at it. He said, wow, this is an incredibly lavish menu. May I ask, what guests are coming over? And Lucius looks at him and he goes, gets a total, aura of indignation and says, dost thou not know that tonight Lucellus dines with Lucellus? and the whole point of that is that we need to take time. We're important. Our health is important, and a way that we can do that is mindful eating. And I know when we're at work and we're busy and we're eating in our cubicles, we can't do that necessarily. But I would challenge everybody to take one meal a day, whether you have time in the morning and you get up early, whether you're at home by yourself in the evening, and really approach it with mindfulness. And this goes back to what we said, because this is actually going to increase your health by lowering your body's level of inflammation. And what the studies show is that the exact ritual doesn't matter. So if you want to say the Lord's Prayer, that's fine. If you want to give thanks to the animal, that's fine. You want to give thanks to the family that's around you, that's fine. It doesn't matter what you do. It's just important that you do it. And so that means, stopping before you eat and have what we call in culinary medicine an attitude of gratitude. Give thanks however you want to do that, for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. As I often say, if you don't have 5 minutes in a day to do this, it means you need 10. And take that time and think about where your food came from, and then immerse yourself in the food experience. Look at it, smell it, and don't just, in the US, we're horrible about, we just eat on the go and we're mindless. But take a bite, chew it. Many ancient meditation practices would say, depending on the practice, you need to chew a bite of food 18 to 24 times. What that's about is, tasting your food. Where does it come from? Really slow down. Enjoy those flavors, those textures. Why that's important, it turns out that when we chew, it sends a signal to our brain, the mechanical act of chewing, but also the sound of us crunching and chewing, the auditory feedback, and starts to set our body up and say we're full, so that we don't overeat. Which is why manufactured food is manufactured to be very soft, so people don't get full when they eat it. So they don't want to make it chewy. So if you can take a mindful approach when you eat, you are on your way to practicing high level culinary medicine, master level culinary medicine.
Okay. Sounds very exciting. Yeah, I love that. Love that. You have had so many years of practice in the field of cardiology, interventional cardiology, and then your other interest in culinary medicine. And in all these years, is there any particularly big challenge? It can be from your personal life, professional life, something from which you have really learned a lot, something that made you look at things and change the way you think, and maybe you want to share that personal experience with us.
Oh, sure. It's actually a great story, and it is a person. It's sort of how did culinary medicine come about in the way that we teach it, and it really comes as you said, from my experience. So I cooked professionally before I went to medical school, so I kind of had that background. And there was a time I was with my partner, world famous cardiologist, and he had trained me as a resident. He left university, went out on his own, and asked me to come join him as his interventional partner. And this guy in the world of interventional cardiology was a rock star. So we had, companies and medical device companies and pharmaceutical companies. There were some at the door every day, bringing us studies and whatnot. And my partner, Brad, one day he had come back from giving a conference in Southern California. And he came back and he said, well, I need to talk with you in the break room, just you and me. And I was a little bit pissed. I was a little peeved because, he's supposed to come back from the conference a couple of days ago. And the night he's coming back, I get this phone call saying, hey, I'm going to be here for a couple more days. Like, no apology, this is what I'm doing. Just like, see ya. And I was like, okay. Thanks, right? And so we go in the bake room and I'm like, it's going to be another thing. Well, I had to meet with this company and, get this research trial, and we're going to be doing this. And he's like, Mike, when I finished giving my lecture in Southern California, I started having chest pain, and I'm a diabetic. And I thought I should get a heart cath right away. And I was like, you're diabetic? I mean, I've been working with you for years. I never knew. And certainly, when he's out whining and dining at these restaurants, eating and drinking like Caligula, with these feasts, he's not certainly taking care of himself like a diabetic. And his response was like, everything's okay. My coronaries were fine. And a couple months later, he collapsed at another conference, and he got flown to the Mayo Clinic, and they found that he had an infection, a cut. Like so many diabetics, I had a cut on the bottom of his foot, didn't know it because he was diabetic, never felt it, got osteomyelitis, which spread to his spine. They had to take out and put rods in his spine. They became infected. And when he woke up from that operation, he was a paraplegic. Yeah. And shortly after that, he suffocated in his bathtub and died. Yeah. And that was a wake-up call. Everything, changed for me, our everything. Yeah. And that was a real wake up call for me also in my personal life, because I'd gotten away. I was so busy working. I was consumed with work. And as a medical professional, I know, like the more you stay, it never ends. Yeah. And you can be in there and be working, 14, 16 hours a day, and there's still more to do. And food had become about convenience, not quality. Yeah. And that was an important lesson, and everything changed. And, I went back to try to heal myself at that point, because I had joint issues, and they had actually recommended I had two joint replacements at that time. And I said, I'm going back to what I know in terms of the food. And I'm proud to say that was over 20 years ago. Still got all my original parts. Okay. And I can't go, jogging for 5 miles on the road, but I can hike the mountains of Montana for 8 hours. So, I'm probably better off than I was 20 plus years ago. And so culinary medicine was born of this personal experience. And when I started looking at the data, I said, well, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. And this doesn't make sense. And this isn't true. And as a chef, I know that that's not right. Is there information out there? And really over the last 10 years, we've had an explosion in things like the gut microbiome that we've talked about, mindfulness, just looking at food differently with the NOVA classification and getting insights into, hey, it's, food of 2020 is very different than food of 1920. So in 100 years, our foods sources have changed. And, it's brought me to this, and this is really, obviously you could tell, but this is my passion. But we talk about heart disease. 8 out of 10 or 80% of heart attacks are preventable. And that's not Chef Dr. Mike's data. That's the American Heart Association. Look it up on their website. Why aren't we doing a better job with food? The 90 to 95% of cases of diabetes, which is epidemic around the world, are type 2 diabetes. 90% of cases of diabetes are preventable with diet. 60%, over 60% of cases of diabetes can be reversed with lifestyle modification. So as you said, exercise, but also diet. We have the data. There's not a lot of pharmaceutical money to be made there. But gosh darn it, why aren't we doing more? And that's one of the reasons that I'm here with Culinary Medicine.
Love that. Absolutely love that. Thank you for sharing that with us. So when people want to learn more about your work, where can they find you?
They can go to www.chefdrmike.com. That's the website. They can sign up and follow us on social media there. We also have information of our online course that links back to all the university stuff. Just because of politics at the university, everybody gets a small square. So we put it all on this webpage so we can tell folks lots more about it. They can download the syllabus, look at the events and things that we're doing. As we said, we do free webinars every month. It's all about trying to get the information out in the hands of people like you. So thank you so much for having me here today so I could share with you. And it's great. I certainly appreciate it. And, I want to, Chef Dr. Fenster would love to be able, when we could travel again, to, come visit you in person in Germany. And, we can go look for those healthy sausages.
Absolutely. That sounds like a plan. Thank you so much for all the great information. And I'm going to link all these in the descriptions. And once again, thank you.